right, y'all. Welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I am the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and I've recorded more than 5,000 interviews going back to 2003, all of which are available at scotthorton.org. You can also sign up for the podcast feed. The full archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Dave DeCamp, assistant news editor at antiwar.com, and he writes opinion pieces too, so that's news.antiwar.com and original.antiwar.com. And this here piece is called The Danger of Sending in the Troops, the Killing of David McAtee. Is that how you say it? Welcome back to the show, Dave. How you doing, man?
Good, Scott. Thanks for having me back.
How do you say the guy's name?
McAtee.
McAtee. Okay, good. Yeah. I guessed.
So
there's no, it's just MC, not MAC, so I wasn't sure if it's, McDonald or MacDonald, like the burger or the comedian. Anyway.
Yeah.
The danger of sending in the troops. The troops killed this guy, the barbecue spot owner there in the protests in Louisville, Kentucky. Is that right?
Yeah. He wasn't participating in any protests, but yeah, he was a barbecue restaurant owner in Louisville.
All right, so zoom all the way out and tell me the entire story.
Yeah, so this was early in the morning on June 1st, just after midnight. So it was on a Sunday night, late Sunday night. And the cops and National Guard deployed to a neighborhood which was apparently miles away from any protests, according to all the reports I've read on this. And they started breaking up a crowd at Dino's Food Mart, which is across from Yaya's Barbecue, which is the name of McAtee's restaurant. And then the surveillance video released by the cops, they released very little, but it shows that a few cops will go across the street to the barbecue restaurant where some people are hanging out outside, and they start firing pepper balls into the crowd. And the crowd starts running into the barbecue restaurant, which is where David McAtee was at the time. The surveillance video showed him like just a minute before the cops showed up. He was outside tending to his grills. He goes inside. Inside is him and his nephew, Marvin. And then all of a sudden, they release surveillance video from inside the shop, too. And that shows a crowd rushing in. And you see David trying to push his way to the door. And the cops continue to fire the pepper balls at the crowd. Them going inside the barbecue restaurant wasn't enough for them, I guess. And one of the last people to come through the door is McAtee's niece, and she gets hit. The cops say the pepper ball hit the doors, but the witnesses say that she was actually hit in the shoulder by a pepper ball. And then you see as David, the store owner, gets to the door, he has a gun holster. He's a gun owner. It looks like he reaches for it and puts his arm straight up in the air and kind of peers through the doorway. And that's when the cops claim he fired a shot. And then he kind of leans back in, and then he creeps out again later. And the cops and the National Guard unload 18 rounds, and one bullet from a National Guard rifle hit David in the chest and killed him. So yeah, that's the story. And I thought it was important to highlight because these cops and National Guard soldiers, they were on the other side of town from any looting or rioting or any protests. And the only reason that they were there to break up the crowd was because of the curfew, because a lot of major cities across the country enacted these curfews. So they initiated the whole situation. It's not getting too much attention, I think, maybe because it does look like McAtee fired his gun at first. But from his perspective, he thought maybe his nephew, who was in there with him at the time, said they thought they were getting looted, maybe. So yeah, it's just a shame. He was shot down in the doorway of his business and his home. He lived in the basement apartment.
In other words, the thing about him possibly thinking he was being looted, you're saying because everyone was running in, he didn't realize they were being cleared by the law. He just knew that they were running afraid from something happening outside, so he went to go and protect them, basically.
Yeah, that's what it looks like, and this all happened within under a minute. And his nephew has said that the people were rushing into his basement apartment, and a lot of them were strangers that they didn't know him, so they kind of, so there was a panic. And another thing about David McAtee that a lot of the news stories said was that he was, he was loved by the community. Everybody, there's a lot of kind words for him after he died. He was very generous, but he was also friends with local cops. Like, he would feed them for free. They said he would refuse to take their money. They would have to throw it down on the counter when he turned his back. And in one of the interviews, his nephew even said a few days before this incident, one of his friends that was a cop was in the restaurant advising him to get a gun or carry his gun because there's been some looting, associated with the protests, and he's a small business owner and to protect himself.
Right.
And after he was killed, one of somebody who was real close with him, who was a cop, Louisville PD, made a real heartfelt Facebook post about it. So it just shows he was a community. He wasn't even a protester. That's what's so horrible about it, is that he was just doing his thing. He was just cooking and hanging out like he did on Sunday nights, really on his own property where he was. Mm-hmm. And he was killed.
And if I understand it right, I'm sorry, I forgot if I read this in your piece, Dave, or somewhere else, that there was reason to believe that maybe he had only fired his gun in the air to scare away whoever it might be, rather than really took a shot at these cops and soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, the surveillance that they released, you can't see his arm behind the door, but it looks like he's aiming his gun in the air. And when the surveillance was released by the cops, there was I saw a local news story. They were pointing out all the other surveillance cameras, pointing at the door that could have shown him in the doorway. Uh-huh. So his family's, suspicious that they're, selectively leaking the footage. Yeah. And another thing is that the two cops that fired their guns that night, 2 cops and 2 National Guardsmen fired their weapons. They didn't have their body cameras on, and that caused the mayor to fire the police chief. That was a day or 2 after the incident happened. And one of the officers, Katie Cruz is her name, she was on Facebook a few days before kind of bragging about pepperballing protesters. She put up a post. It was a picture of a protester giving her flowers or something. And in the caption, she wrote she was doing a lot more than offering me flowers. And I hope those pepper balls that she got lit up with later hurt. And then she said something like, come back later on. I'm on the line again, with a bicep emoji. And I was just reading from watching the surveillance. It's kind of I figured she was one of the 2 cops that were pepperballing and then pulled out their sidearm. And I was just reading from the Courier-Journal, which is a Louisville local paper. They just did an investigation. And she was the one that kind of started the whole thing, that went across the street and just started shooting pepper balls and shot into the doorway. So it was her recklessness that started it, and then having the National Guard at her back is what killed him. So,
yeah, no surprise there. And man, when you talk about they fired 18 shots, one of the soldiers' rifle rounds went through the guy's chest, and that was it, right? He shot one time, is that right?
Yeah, he was just shot one time.
So the 17 rounds that went wild are almost as scandalous as the murder of this guy. I mean, they could have killed anybody. Mm-hmm. Just apparently firing completely blindly or with no skill whatsoever into a crowd of people.
Yeah.
I mean, 17 wild rounds. How lucky is it that a bystander didn't get their head blown off in that?
Yeah, it is lucky. I mean, at the time, it seemed like most of the people were in the barbecue shop. Luckily, because if they were still outside, they probably would have been killed. But yeah, I mean, with the door open, just the fact that they kept firing the pepper balls into the doorway is just what's so absurd about this.
Yeah. And it is such an important point what you said, that they had no business here whatsoever. I mean, if there was this curfew, they were, if anything, supposed to be enforcing it against protesters and or rioters out there somewhere. But instead, this is just a bunch of young people hanging out in the parking lot in their, Friday night spot or whatever it was, whatever night it was. They're hanging out, listening to music and having fun. And they came and broke this up for no reason whatsoever, other than the fun of picking a fight and enforcing some edict.
Yeah. And it looks like there's some cell phone footage from across the street at the food market where they're breaking up the crowd. It looks like they were telling people to leave, but then across the street at the barbecue shop, they just showed up and just started. They didn't announce themselves. They just started pepperballing the crowd. And the family's lawyer pointed out that they violated, their policies for dispersing a crowd. They're supposed to, announce themselves, do it non-violently, and give people like time to disperse. But instead, they just showed up firing. And he also makes the point, the lawyer, which I liked, is that the only people who get the benefit of the doubt in like a similar situation are cops. Like they could shoot a child with a toy gun in a park and get away with it. But David McAtee can be in his home and a crowd rushes in and there's some kind of projectiles firing in. One hits his niece, and it looks like he just went to fire a warning shot. And they found the shells next to his gun, but they haven't found the bullet in the area at all, in the street or anything, which makes it seem like he probably fired it in the air.
Yeah. And, I saw a clip of his cousin or his son or nephew or someone. Maybe it was his brother. I'm sorry.
It's probably his nephew. He's been doing like
I guess it was the nephew, was saying, oh, look, they want to say he fired first, but they fired first. And they want to say, oh, yeah, but that wasn't a live round. That was just a pepper ball or something. Yeah, so you're just, I forgot the way he said it. Was something funny and should have been memorable. It was like, you're just trying to remix it, something like that, trying to change the story all around. You fired first. Now you want to get technical on what kind of ammo. But for the people under fired, they were being fired upon. And if he did anything, shooting his gun in the air, even if it had been at them, he didn't say this part, but even if it had been at them, it was in defense. They were the ones who started it, not him.
Yeah.
And then, by the way, and this goes to the title of your piece here, too, is about how when we're talking about all those wild rounds, that included every shot fired by those local cops. And so if the soldiers hadn't been there, he would still be alive.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And
or maybe the cops would have rushed in there and executed the whole restaurant full of people hiding in the kitchen. I don't know, but...
Yeah, who knows? Apparently, his nephew got on the phone with 911 after his uncle was shot and killed, and said like, there's people in here that want to come out. They're scared, so he kind of diffused the situation afterwards, I guess. But yeah, I mean, if he just ducked back inside again, they could have done that without, if it was just those cops shooting those wild rounds, they could have diffused it, and he could still be alive. They would probably have arrested him, which like they arrested Brianna Taylor's boyfriend.
And it's like they were showing up on a crime scene here, right? They're clearing a parking lot of people having a good time. They're enforcing a thing, but there's no reason to think there are any armed felons around here committing crimes right now. They're the ones who showed up and instigated the entire thing.
Yeah. And, I titled it "The Danger of Sending in the Troops" because I just think it shows like just deploying an army, even though it was initiated by the cops' recklessness, the violence, but just deploying an army into these, black urban neighborhoods. It's just a recipe for disaster to enact curfews and there could have been a lot more David McAtees if Tom Cotton got his wish,
Hey man, you guys are going to love No Dev, No Ops, No IT by Hussein Badakhshani. It's a fun and interesting read all about how to run your high-tech company like a good libertarian should. Forget all the junk. Read No Dev, No Ops, No IT by Hussein Badakhshani. Find it in the margin at scotthorton.org. Hey, y'all, here's the thing. Donate $100 to the Scott Horton Show, and you can get a QR code commodity disc as my gift to you. It's a 1-ounce silver disc with a QR code on the back. You take a picture of it with your phone, and it gives you the instant spot price and lets you know what that ounce of silver is worth on the market in Federal Reserve notes in real time. It's the future of currency in the past, too. CommodityDiscs.com or just go to scotthorton.org/donate. Hey guys, Scott Horton here for ExpandDesigns.com. Harley Abbott and his crew do an outstanding job designing, building, and maintaining my sites, and they'll do great work for you. You need a new website? Go to expanddesigns.com/Scott and save $500. And by the way, when it comes to the protests, I think the riots really gave the protests a bad name in the first few days there, but the riots have really seemed to have subsided. I mean, there's some crime and looting going on here or there, but rioting, it doesn't seem like it. And even the looting is way, way, way down, and the protest movement has continued. And I read that it was 700 cities across the country, 700 and something, already had these protests. And yet here in Louisville, Kentucky, they had an extra reason to protest, not just for George Floyd and for, the general history of police oppression in their town, but they had the case of Breonna Taylor. It was right there in Louisville just a few weeks back. And and due to public pressure, they actually passed a ordinance, I guess, in that city of Louisville, not a state law, but a city ordinance, banning no-knock SWAT team raids, calling it Breonna's Law. And Rand Paul, believe it or not, actually is trying to introduce a federal law in the Senate that would use, federal funds for local police as a way to twist arms to get them to ban no-knock raids. And in her name, the Breonna Taylor Act is what they're trying to call it on the federal level. And I've had mean things to say about Rand Paul from time to time, but this is absolutely, necessary and therefore heroic for him to do. But anyway, just a point being, though, the people in Louisville, not any of the people at the barbecue place that night, but the people who were protesting, They sure had something to protest about here. And I thought it was important that you mentioned what happened to her. And I've kind of begged the question and baked in her innocence into my story here. But why don't you go ahead and tell what happened to her so that people understand why this is, for many people, just as much of a symbolic case as what happened to poor George Floyd.
Yeah, well, Brianna Taylor, she was a 26-year-old EMT who'd been working through the whole coronavirus pandemic, but the people that are now, everybody's calling heroes these days, she was definitely one of them. And one night, the cops kicked down her door where she lived with her boyfriend, and they didn't know who it was, and he fired on the cops. I believe he fired first, and then they unloaded on the apartment, which killed Breonna Taylor, and then they retreated because they don't like it when people fire back. But if you listen to the 911 call, which I listened to, you posted on the Libertarian Institute, it's horrible. I mean, he had no idea that it was the cops, and in the call, he's like, realizing that she's dead. It's just such a horrible story. And from what I understand, they were going to raid an apartment where a drug dealer had been shipping drugs, but this guy was already in jail. And I'm not sure if it was the wrong apartment. You probably know more about this case than I do. Was it the wrong apartment? But I know the dealer was. Yeah,
and they're blaming the postal inspector, and the postal inspector is denying responsibility and saying, I never said that they were getting contraband at that address. Don't blame me for that. Yeah. And so they're trying to pass the buck around there. But yeah, they were saying essentially they're pretending to believe, or maybe they did believe, that she was receiving packages for this guy who they busted somewhere else that night for contraband. But I mean, that just goes to show they had already caught him somewhere else earlier in the night. So yeah. They had every reason then, if they think that, first of all, it's a woman in there, not some hardened gang leader, but, possibly a girlfriend or, an acquaintance of this guy doing him a favor, right? That they could have just waited until 9 a.m. and sent a guy in a cheap suit over there to knock on the door and say, we'd like to have a look around. There was no reason whatsoever for them to crash in her door. And I guess, forgot which thing it was I read that said that they had 3 warrants that night, And on the other one, they never did execute it. Or at least that night they didn't. So that just goes to show that, they didn't have to do it at her house either. But they decided to. And then it turns out that apparently there's nothing to that at all. There's no reason to believe that she was receiving packages of contraband in the mail. Which, can you believe that would be a crime? Like, a drug businessman received his supplies so he could supply his customers. Where's it? Yeah, big deal. Anyway.
Yeah. And then from what I understand, they still haven't arrested any of those cops. Or, I mean, not that that's a surprise, but the new with everything going on, that's what people are pushing for.
Yeah.
And then the National Guard, that the two cops that fired on McAtee, they're on administrative leave, which means they're getting paid to sit home. And then the National Guard is not releasing the names of the soldiers that fired too, and so there won't be any accountability for them. They probably even have an extra layer of protection.
Yeah. And then, you know what? Everybody's outrage is so partisan and so diffused that instead of this being a fire bell in the night and a Kent State atrocity type situation, it's just another thing that happened. Or I don't know, maybe not. I mean, it seemed, well, I'll tell you what, it's just the very beginning of a very long, hot summer day. We're going to see how it goes. But people have absolutely had enough of the police abuse, and it's just, you know what it is? And the cops have always been bad, and I think they are worse. And it's the qualified immunity and the militarization has a lot to do with it. But another thing is that Facebook and Twitter have made it where everybody's got a soapbox, and anybody you know can show you a video of a local atrocity that would have never made the Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, New York Times, monopoly narrative machine of a previous generation. It just wouldn't have ever come through. Instead, now each one of these local stories is a national story, and they can't stop it. And so now that happens, hey, it's a big country with a lot of localities and a lot of police abuse and a lot of killings, and a lot of innocent people maimed and put through hell, and then it's just like a deluge. And it's like that movie UHF, Drink from the Fire Hose. It's just absolutely out of control. And so people are just overwhelmed. Not just black people, and certainly not just criminals, but all kind of regular people are sick and tired of the cops and the way that they treat everybody. And it's this kind of thing, these kinds of things. And by the way, as long as I'm ranting and raving all over your interview here, pal, I read this thing in the Rolling Stone, and I can't remember the title anymore, and it was something about how, Breonna Taylor was a heroic EMT. She saved people's lives for a living. But so what? That really shouldn't have anything to do with it. If she was just some couch potato who was not productive for anyone else, that'd be fine too. She doesn't owe us anything, which is a pretty good libertarian take for the Rolling Stone, I thought. That, it doesn't matter if she's a productive member of society or not. Never mind that she's one of the very best of us, which we're all willing to concede. But even, the lowest loser living under a bridge has the right to not be waxed by the cops like this. All of us do. And so she shouldn't have to have been a hero to be a martyr. You know what I mean? In fact, you look at George Floyd, he's no hero, but he sure is a martyr because of what they did to him, and that just shows the contrast maybe in their personal lives or what have you. But they had just as much right as each other to not be destroyed this way. It's crazy that that's the way we operate in this society. It really is.
It is. Yeah, and I wish more people were putting forward real solutions, like the qualified immunity thing that Amash put forward.
Listen, one more thing here about the militarization is that in almost every case where the National Guard was called out here, it was unnecessary. If the cops had left the protesters alone and focused only on people setting arson fires and stealing stuff, they had far more than enough manpower to do their job without the National Guard at all. Then you talk about Donald Trump and his itchy trigger finger. Did you see this piece by Jack Murphy about the 87th Airborne or whatever it was that was deployed? It was about to be deployed on the streets of D.C., who actually were sent there think it was the
Yeah,
87th
I did.
year.
Yeah, they were ready to go.
Man, I mean, and just talk about unnecessary and, swatting a fly with a howitzer and this kind of thing. When, any domestic police force in America, any sheriff's department or city police force can put down any insurrection in any one part of town if they're focused on the people who are actually causing violence and destruction.
Well,
and we saw in case after case the way they focused on the protesters while people are, running off with TVs and whatever.
Yeah, from my own personal experience here in New York, I live in South Brooklyn, and there was some serious looting in Manhattan, kind of one little stretch of Manhattan. There was a little bit of violence in Brooklyn, but not much, no like real looting or anything. There's like a few shootings, but sometimes like gangs take advantage of the chaos, But I saw a lot of protesters in Brooklyn, and they were all peaceful, and I saw a lot of cops dressed up in riot gear because I was delivering food. My wife she owns a business. I was helping her make deliveries, and I was like navigating through these protests. And I see all these protesters walking peacefully, and then waiting for them is like just a bunch of cops in riot gear, just like ready to battle. And then you have on the news and all these right wingers like calling to send in the guard and the army to New York to stop the looting. But I mean, like send more. You could have sent the cops to deal with the looting in Manhattan, got them out of Brooklyn to stop harassing these protesters, or they were blocking protesters that were walking over the Manhattan Bridge while down the street people were breaking windows and looting. It's just ridiculous, the curfews and enforcing that instead of actually protecting people's property.
Yeah. And of course, the government, led by the cops, are the ones who caused all the riots in the first place. Let's not forget that. Due to their monopoly, they're the only security force anybody has to turn to. And so I guess with the election coming up, we'll see just how far people side toward law and order when it comes to that. That's definitely the worst part of the protest. But then again, hey, the government fired all the protesters from all their jobs. So they got nothing to do but protest. And people can't keep up rioting and looting and chaos for, other than short bursts in certain places. But they can keep up a protest movement, and they have been. And I don't know all the numbers in all the cities and what have you, but people are staying very firm about this and continuing the peaceful protests, which is also a show of force. As Dave Smith was telling me, pointing out that really every large march is a potential riot, isn't it? And it's a latent sort of a threat. It's, we're being nice now, but what if we were angry is sort of implied in having a giant, what if we were really angry and is implied in having a mass protest. But so, we should definitely encourage those. And I'm certainly really happy to see that. And it's unfortunate, as you said, the way some of the energy from it is maybe being wasted on some things. But there's already some good steps like banning night raids in Louisville. Just night raids in Louisville. That's enough to save a few lives. You know what I mean? That's not nothing. And that's just a start here. So,
it's impressive. Hopefully, I'm definitely impressed by everybody that's been.
And, I'm always trying to coin Iraq War 1, 2, and 3. I don't know why that doesn't catch on, but we should really try to push night raids because that is exactly what they are. But that's what they call them when they send in the Delta Force and the Navy SEALs in Afghanistan. And so that makes the real point, I think. Not just no-knocks, but night raids, because that is what it is. Paramilitary. I mean, these guys are trained by special operations guys. Not very well, but, So, anyway, it's just a thing. It's just a little thing, but maybe help move a margin somewhere. I'm way over time. Thank you. And I apologize for spending so much time talking during your interview.
Oh, no, it's okay. This isn't my, my usual topic that I write about. Everything I've written about for Antiwar.com has been foreign policy. But unfortunately, a U.S. soldier killed an American citizen, so I had to draw attention to it.
Yep, absolutely. Well, listen, I'm really glad that we have you around, dude. You do great work, Dave. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Scott.
All right, you guys, that is Dave DeCamp, assistant news editor at antiwar.com. This one is called The Danger of Sending in the Troops, the Killing of David McAtee. The Scott Horton Show and Anti-War Radio can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. apsradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.